The date, August 1943. The place, a logging camp in northern Finland. The temperature, warm enough that sweat soaks through wool shirts, cold enough that you still need the wool. A Finnish lumberjack named Arvo Järvinen sat on a stump during his lunch break, staring at the broken axe handle in his hands. The head had come loose again, third time that month. He pulled out his knife and started whittling a wedge, but his mind wasn't on the axe. It was on his younger brother, who had written from the front about a problem that was getting men killed. Russian tanks were breaking through. The anti-tank rifles weren't working. The mines were too few. And the men, his brother wrote, felt helpless. They could shoot a man. They couldn't stop a machine. Järvinen looked at the axe head, looked at the wedge, and something clicked in his mind. Not a solution exactly, more like a question. What if the simplest answer had been sitting in every tool shed in Finland the entire time? This is the story of how a logging tool became a weapon that would destroy hundreds of Soviet tanks. But it's really about something deeper, about the moment when desperation stripped away every assumption about how war was supposed to work, about how soldiers were supposed to fight. And what it reveals about human ingenuity is this. Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas don't come from engineers or generals or weapons designers. They come from people who just couldn't afford to think the way they'd been taught. By the summer of 1943, the Winter War was a painful memory, and the continuation war was grinding Finland into dust. The Soviet Union had learned its lessons from 1939. No more columns of tanks stumbling through forests unprepared. No more underestimating the Finnish capacity for making every snowdrift, every tree line, every frozen lake into a killing ground. This time they came with organization, with overwhelming numbers, with a production capacity that made Finnish resources look like a child's allowance compared to an oil baron's fortune. And they came with tanks, lots of tanks. The T-34, primarily that masterpiece of Soviet engineering that combined speed, armor, and firepower into a package that redefined armored warfare. Sloped armor that deflected shots. A 76-millimeter gun that could gut a bunker. Tracks wide enough to handle mud and snow that would trap lighter vehicles. It wasn't just a good tank. It was a tank that made most anti-tank weapons obsolete the moment it rolled off the production line. Finland's soldiers knew this machine intimately. They'd seen it smash through positions that should have held. They'd watched anti-tank rifles, the Lahti L-39, bounce rounds off that sloped armor like throwing pebbles at a fortress wall. The Lahti was a beautiful weapon, precision-engineered, accurate, powerful enough to punch through earlier tank models. Against the T-34, it was a psychological weapon at best. You could damage the tracks if you got lucky. You could hit a vision port if you got very lucky. You could die if the tank crew spotted you, which they usually did, because firing a Lahti was like lighting a signal flare that screamed, "I am here, please run me over." The soldiers needed something else, something that didn't require precision manufacturing, something that didn't require supply lines stretching back to factories that Finland barely had, something that could be made by anyone, anywhere, from materials you could find in a barn. The idea that would save them came from wood, specifically from the way you attach an axe head to a handle. It's simple physics. You slide the handle through the eye of the axe head. Then you drive a wooden wedge into the top of the handle, expanding it, creating friction, locking the head in place. The wedge doesn't just sit there. It becomes part of the structural integrity of the tool. Remove it, and the whole thing falls apart. This is technology that dates back thousands of years. Every farmer knew it, every carpenter knew it, every lumberjack knew it, and one lumberjack wondered, what if you could apply that same principle to a shaped charge? Shaped charges were not new in 1943. The physics had been understood since the 1880s. You take an explosive charge and line it with a cone of metal, usually copper. When the explosive detonates, it doesn't just explode outward in all directions. The cone collapses inward and then shoots forward as a jet of superheated metal moving at hypersonic speeds. This jet can punch through armor plate like a blowtorch through butter. The problem wasn't the physics. The problem was deployment. Shaped charges needed to detonate at precisely the right distance from the target. Too close, and the jet doesn't form properly. Too far, and it dissipates before penetrating. Military engineers had solved this with complex fuses, standoff mechanisms, carefully calculated designs, all of which required manufacturing precision Finland didn't have. Järvinen's insight was embarrassingly simple. You don't need complex engineering. You need a wooden stick. Take a shaped charge, attach it to a wooden pole, add a simple contact fuse, and suddenly you have a weapon that maintains perfect standoff distance automatically. The wood acts like the wedge in an axe handle, a simple mechanical solution to what everyone had been treating as an engineering problem. The pole keeps the charge at exactly the right distance. The pole gives the soldier reach, so he's not trying to place a magnetic mine while machine gun bullets turn the air around him into a metal storm. The pole is disposable. You make it from lumber, from fence posts, from furniture, from any piece of wood roughly the right length. And the pole transforms a static defensive weapon into something mobile, something aggressive, something that turns infantry into tank hunters instead of tank victims. The Finnish military didn't immediately embrace the idea. There's a tendency in military institutions to distrust simplicity. Complex problems are supposed to require complex solutions. A weapon that looked like it was assembled in a barn didn't inspire confidence in men who'd been trained to respect precision instruments. The first prototypes were crude. Explosives strapped to poles with whatever adhesive or binding material was available. Fuses that were more prayer than mechanism. Testing was dangerous. One early test resulted in the charge detonating prematurely, and the concussive force alone was enough to rupture eardrums 50 feet away. But the ones that worked spectacularly. The shaped charge jet would punch through T-34 armor like it wasn't there, not just penetrate, catastrophically penetrate. The jet would enter the tank's interior and turn everything inside into shrapnel. Ammunition would cook off. Fuel would ignite. Crew members would die instantly or wish they had. By late 1943, the weapon had a name, the Panzer Sack, though Finnish soldiers had less formal terms. Some called it the woodpecker because you had to get close like a bird landing on a tree. Some called it the Widowmaker because getting close enough to use it meant accepting odds that would make a casino owner blush. The official designation was irrelevant. What mattered was that suddenly Finnish infantry had something they'd lacked: agency. They weren't just targets waiting for armor to roll over them. They were predators, and the most advanced Soviet tank was prey, if you were brave enough or desperate enough or crazy enough to get within striking distance. Training soldiers to use the Panzersack required breaking down every instinct that kept men alive in combat. Every soldier knew the first rule of facing armor: don't be where the armor is going. Create distance. Use obstacles. Let the tanks pass and hit them from behind. The Panzersack required the opposite. It required moving toward the tank. It required getting close enough that you could hear the crew talking inside, close enough that the heat from the engine made sweat run down your face, even in Finnish cold, close enough that if anything went wrong, there would be nothing left of you to bury. The men who volunteered for this, and it was always volunteers because ordering men into that kind of proximity to armor was effectively ordering executions, were a specific type. Not necessarily brave. Bravery implies choice made from a position of options. These were men who'd already decided they were dead and had simply chosen to make their deaths count for something. The first confirmed kill with a Panzersack came in September 1943 during a Soviet armored probe near Karelia. 3 T-34s had punched through a defensive line, scattering infantry, rolling toward a supply depot that contained ammunition the Finns could not afford to lose. a corporal named Tapio Virtanen, who before the war had been a schoolteacher and whose letters home were filled with desperate longing for anything resembling normal life, grabbed a panzer sack from a weapons cache and moved toward the lead tank. The after-action report is clinical in its language. The witness testimonies are not. Virtanen approached from the tank's left side, using a destroyed building for cover. The T-34's machine gun was traversing right, suppressing Finnish positions in that direction. The main gun had just fired, and there's a moment after a tank fires when the crew is distracted, when their attention is on the target they just engaged, on reloading, on confirming the kill. Virtanen moved during that moment. He covered 30 meters of open ground in a sprint that witnesses described as surreal, like watching a man run toward his own execution. The tank crew saw him at the last second. The hull machine gun began to traverse. It was too late. Virtanen planted the pole against the tank's side armor and let physics do the rest. The shaped charge detonated with a crack that was more felt than heard, a pressure wave that made witnesses' vision blur. The jet punched through. Inside the tank, hell arrived instantly. The jet didn't just penetrate the armor, it vaporized a cone of metal that turned into shrapnel inside the crew compartment. It ignited ammunition. The T-34 didn't explode cinematically. It just stopped. Smoke began pouring from every hatch, then fire, then screaming briefly, before the ammunition cooked off and the screaming stopped. Virtanen survived. He made it back to Finnish lines, was violently sick behind a ruined wall, and then picked up another panzer sack and asked which tank was next. He would destroy 4 more tanks before the war ended. His official commendation praised his courage. His diary, discovered decades later, told a different story. He didn't feel courageous. He felt like a man who'd discovered the only way to fight a nightmare was to run at it, because running away just meant dying tired. The Soviets noticed. At first, they attributed the destroyed tanks to mines, to hidden anti-tank guns, to anything except the possibility that Finnish infantry had developed a weapon that turned foot soldiers into armor killers. The truth emerged through interrogations of captured Finnish soldiers and through the physical evidence of destroyed tanks. The penetration patterns were wrong for mines. The damage was too focused, too directional. Soviet tankers began receiving warnings about Finnish infantry armed with pole charges. The warnings were more unsettling than helpful. How do you defend against a weapon that requires the attacker to get within touching distance? You can't armor against determination. You can't outmaneuver desperation. Soviet tactical doctrine began to shift. Tanks that had previously operated with minimal infantry support, relying on armor and firepower to clear resistance, now required infantry screens, foot soldiers to spot and kill the Finnish tank hunters before they could get close. This slowed advances. It complicated logistics. It meant that every meter of Finnish territory cost more in time and blood and resources than Soviet planners had calculated. The T-34 was still a superior machine, but machines require space to operate, and the Finns had figured out how to collapse that space, how to force the war into distances where Soviet advantages in production and firepower meant nothing. The psychological impact on Soviet tank crews was profound. Tank warfare is supposed to feel safe. You're inside a metal shell. Enemy bullets bounce off. Enemy soldiers are targets, not threats. The panzer sack inverted that relationship. Suddenly, being inside a tank felt like being inside a tomb that you'd volunteered to climb into. Every piece of cover could hide a man with a pole. Every moment of inattention could be the last mistake you ever made. Soviet combat reports from late 1943 and early 1944 show increasing incidents of tanks refusing to advance without overwhelming infantry support, of crews abandoning functional vehicles when they took minor damage, of psychological casualties among tankers who'd never been physically wounded but who could no longer force themselves to close hatches and drive toward Finnish positions. The Panzersack wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement about the nature of the war Finland was fighting. The Soviet Union had factories. Finland had forests. The Soviet Union had engineering departments and research budgets. Finland had lumberjacks who knew how to make things work with whatever materials were available. This wasn't romantic. It was math. Finland couldn't outproduce the Soviets. It couldn't outlast them. It couldn't match them in any conventional metric of military power. What it could do was make every Soviet advantage expensive to use, make every meter of advance cost enough that eventually the advance would stop, not because it was impossible, but because it was no longer worth the price. By early 1944, production of the Panzersack had spread beyond official military channels. Civilians were manufacturing them in workshops, in garages, in barns. The design was so simple that it could be communicated verbally. The materials were so common that supply chains were irrelevant. Farmers who'd never seen combat were assembling charges and delivering them to collection points. Women who'd lost husbands to Soviet tanks were packing explosives with the kind of focused intensity that comes from grief converted into purpose. The weapon had become decentralized, a kind of distributed resistance that military logistics couldn't disrupt because there was no central point to disrupt. German observers, and Germany was nominally Finland's ally during this period, though the relationship was complicated by mutual distrust and competing interests, took note of the Panzersack with professional interest. Germany had its own shaped-charge anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust series, which operated on similar principles but with more sophisticated engineering. What impressed German observers wasn't the sophistication, it was the adaptability. The Finns had taken a concept that German engineers had refined into a precision instrument and stripped it down to the absolute minimum necessary components. No fancy triggering mechanisms, no calculated explosive lenses, just a charge, a pole, and a contact fuse. It was elegant in the way that poverty makes things elegant, by burning away everything except what's absolutely essential. The effectiveness of the Panzersack created its own problems. Soviet intelligence began prioritizing the capture of samples. They wanted to understand the design, develop countermeasures, potentially copy it for their own use. Finnish soldiers were ordered to destroy damaged Panzersacks rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. This was partly military security, but it was also psychological warfare. As long as the Soviets didn't fully understand how simple the weapon was, they would overestimate Finnish capabilities. They would imagine sophisticated engineering, complex manufacturing, stockpiles that didn't exist. The reality that the weapon could be produced faster than Finland could produce the men to use it was more terrifying than any sophisticated weapon system. There's a recorded incident from February 1944 that captures the bizarre psychological dynamic the Panzersack created. A Soviet T-34 had been disabled by track damage, not destroyed, just immobilized. The crew abandoned it and retreated. Finnish troops approached and found the crew had left a note inside in broken Finnish that translated approximately to, "We would rather face your artillery than your wooden poles." This wasn't admiration. It was testimony to the specific kind of fear the weapon generated. Artillery was random. You could survive it through luck. The Panzersack was personal. It required a man to walk up to your tank and place death against the armor you'd thought would protect you. That's a different category of threat. That's the threat that follows you into nightmares. The limitations of the Panzersack were never secret. It required courage that most people don't possess. It had a range measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. It was useless against tank formations in open terrain where approach was impossible. Weather affected it. Rain could damage the explosive. Extreme cold could make the fuses unreliable. A soldier carrying one was burdened, slow, conspicuous. If spotted before striking distance, he was effectively a stationary target carrying his own funeral pyre. The weapon's effectiveness depended entirely on conditions that favored the defender, that allowed close approach, that provided cover and confusion and distraction. In a war of maneuver, in open tank battles on the steppes, it would have been nearly useless. But Finland wasn't fighting on the steppes. It was fighting in forests and marshes and broken terrain where tanks had to follow predictable paths, where visibility was measured in dozens of meters, where the advantages that made the T-34 dominant everywhere else meant less than the advantages of knowing the ground and being willing to die on it. The human cost of using the Panzersack was extraordinary. Casualty rates among tank hunter teams were above 70%. Most men who used the weapon effectively didn't survive to use it a second time. This wasn't sustainable in any military sense. You can't build doctrine around weapons that kill the user. But sustainability requires having better options. Finland didn't have better options. It had the Panzersack and the men willing to use it, and the fact that using it was nearly suicidal just meant that the men who volunteered were men who'd already made peace with not going home. By the time the Moscow Armistice was signed in September 1944, ending Finland's participation in the war, Finnish forces had destroyed an estimated 600 Soviet tanks using Panzersacks. The number is disputed. Soviet records are incomplete. Finnish claims may be inflated by the fog of war and the natural human tendency to count the same destroyed vehicle multiple times. But even if the real number was half that, even if it was a third, the strategic impact was undeniable. 600 tanks is not a number that changes the outcome of the war. The Soviet Union was producing thousands of tanks, but 600 tanks is a number that changes calculations. It's a number that makes advances more cautious. It's a number that buys time, and time was the only currency Finland had enough of to matter. The post-war analysis of the Panzersack by military historians and weapons designers reveals a tension that runs through all of military innovation. The weapon was brilliant. It was also stupid. It solved a problem in the most direct possible way, without elegance, without sophistication, with nothing except brutal simplicity. From an engineering perspective, it was almost insulting. Shaped charges were supposed to be complex. Anti-tank warfare was supposed to require precision instruments. The idea that you could tape a bomb to a stick and kill a T-34 suggested that all the sophisticated engineering was possibly unnecessary, possibly even counterproductive. That's an uncomfortable suggestion for institutions built on the assumption that complex problems require complex solutions. There's a deeper question embedded in the story of the Panzersack, one that extends beyond military history into the realm of how humans solve problems under existential pressure. Arvo Järvinen, the lumberjack whose observation about axe handles supposedly inspired the weapon, never received official recognition. There's debate about whether the story is even true or if it's a folktale that emerged after the fact to give narrative shape to an innovation that probably had multiple origins. What's not debatable is that someone, somewhere, looked at a problem that military engineers were solving with complexity and asked a simpler question. What if you didn't need complexity? What if the solution was so obvious that everyone had overlooked it precisely because it was obvious? This happens more often than institutions like to admit. The history of warfare is full of innovations that came from outside official channels, from soldiers who improvised in the field, from civilians who didn't know the proper way to solve problems and so solved them in improper ways that worked better than the proper ways. The Panzersack is an extreme example because of how simple it was, how transparently it worked, and how effectively it killed machines that were supposed to be nearly invulnerable. But the pattern it represents, the pattern of desperation, forcing simplicity, of resource scarcity forcing innovation, of people who can't afford sophisticated solutions, finding unsophisticated ones that work, that pattern is universal. Consider what it meant to be a Finnish soldier in 1943 being handed a wooden pole with explosives attached and told that this was your anti-tank weapon. You'd been trained, probably, on the Lottie anti-tank rifle. You'd been taught to respect Soviet armor. You'd seen T-34s roll through positions that should have stopped them. And now your defense was this thing that looked like it had been assembled by a farmer who'd raided a munitions depot. The cognitive dissonance must have been profound. This can't work. This is insane. This is going to get me killed. And then you'd see it work. You'd watch a T-34 brewing up after a Panzersack strike, watch the crew bail out burning, watch a 30-ton machine reduced to scrap by a weapon that weighed maybe 10 pounds. And your understanding of warfare would shift. Maybe the sophisticated weapon wasn't the better weapon. Maybe the sophisticated weapon was just the weapon that made engineers feel important. Soviet tankers experienced a mirror version of that dissonance. They'd been taught that the T-34 was the finest tank in the world, that its armor and speed made it nearly invincible against infantry, that Finnish forces were poorly equipped and couldn't threaten modern armor, and then they'd take a Panzersack strike. If they survived, if they bailed out before the ammunition cooked off, they'd look at the penetration hole and try to understand what had hit them. They'd expect damage consistent with an anti-tank gun, with a mine, with something that looked like a weapon. Instead, they'd find evidence of a shaped charge on a pole. It was humiliating. It was terrifying. It meant that the protection they'd relied on was psychological as much as physical, and the Finns had figured out how to attack the psychology by making the physics irrelevant. The period between late 1943 and mid-1944 saw Soviet tactical doctrine evolve rapidly in response to the Panzersack threat. Tanks began operating with strict infantry screens. Advance speeds decreased, suppressive fire increased, not aimed at visible targets but at potential hiding spots, at cover that could conceal a man with a pole. This wasn't paranoia. This was rational adaptation to a threat that violated the assumed rules of tank warfare, but adaptation had costs: fuel costs, ammunition costs, time costs. The Finns couldn't stop Soviet advances, but they could make those advances expensive enough that Soviet commanders had to recalculate whether objectives were worth the price. That's strategic impact. That's how a small nation with minimal resources fights a superpower. Not by winning, by making winning so expensive that it stops feeling like winning. There's an interview recorded in the 1970s with a Soviet tank commander who'd fought in Finland. He'd gone on to fight across Eastern Europe, had participated in the drive to Berlin, had survived the entire war. The interviewer asked what combat experience had affected him most. The commander didn't mention Kursk, didn't mention Berlin, he mentioned Finland. Specifically, he mentioned the month he'd spent in Karelia in early 1944, operating a T-34 in terrain that favored defenders. He described the constant tension, the inability to feel safe even inside armor, the knowledge that every moment of inattention could be the moment a Finnish soldier got close enough to plant a charge. He described watching another tank in his unit brew up, watching the crew bail out, seeing one crew member on fire, and running and screaming before he collapsed. He said that image stayed with him more vividly than anything from the later campaigns. Not because the death was worse, death was universal on the Eastern Front, but because it was so personal. Someone had walked up to that tank, had placed death against it, had done it deliberately, intimately, with full knowledge of what would happen. That kind of violence felt different than artillery or mines or long-range guns. It felt like murder. And the commander, 40 years later, still sounded unsettled describing it. That's the psychological legacy of the Panzersack. It wasn't just effective in military terms, it was disturbing in human terms. It forced everyone involved, attackers and defenders, to confront the intimacy of violence that modern warfare usually tries to obscure. Artillery kills from kilometers away. Rifles kill from hundreds of meters. Even grenades allow some distance. The Panzersack required touching the target, required being close enough to make eye contact with the crew if they looked out at the wrong moment, required accepting that you might be close enough to die in the same fireball that killed them. That's not modern warfare. That's ancient warfare, the kind where you could smell your enemy's fear, conducted with modern explosives. The technical evolution of the Panzersack over its brief operational life shows how even the simplest designs can be refined. Early versions used basic contact fuses that were unreliable. Later versions incorporated slightly more sophisticated triggering mechanisms, still simple, but more consistent. The poles themselves evolved. Early versions used whatever wood was available, which meant varying lengths and varying durability. Standardization improved reliability. Some versions incorporated rudimentary sights, though at the ranges involved, aiming was more about courage than precision. The explosive itself saw refinement, different compositions tested for reliability in Finnish weather conditions. None of these improvements made the weapon sophisticated. They just made it more consistently lethal, which was the only metric that mattered. By mid-1944, as Finnish forces transitioned from fighting the Soviets to fighting their former German allies during the Lapland War, the Panzersack found new targets. German armor was technically superior to Soviet armor in many respects, but the same principle applied. A shaped charge doesn't care about engineering excellence, it cares about physics. German Tigers and Panthers, with their heavy armor and powerful guns, were vulnerable to the same wooden poles that had killed T-34s. German tankers, who'd spent years developing doctrine for armored warfare on the steppes, found themselves in Finnish forests facing the same impossible choice Soviet tankers had faced: advance and risk the pole charges, stay back and fail to complete objectives. There was no good answer. That was the point. The production total for Panzersacks during the war is unknown. Records were incomplete. Much production happened outside official channels. Estimates range from several thousand to over 10,000. The actual number is less important than what it represents. These were weapons made by a nation that couldn't afford a proper arms industry, distributed to soldiers who couldn't afford to fight fair, used in circumstances where conventional military wisdom said defense was impossible. And they worked, not because they were sophisticated, because they were adequate, because adequate was all Finland needed them to be. Consider the implications of that for how we think about warfare, about technology, about problem-solving under resource constraints. The conventional wisdom is that technical superiority matters, that better engineering wins, that sophistication provides advantage. The Panzersack suggests the opposite. It suggests that sometimes the better weapon is the weapon you can make 10,000 of, not the weapon that works perfectly. It suggests that sometimes simplicity is superiority, that reliability matters more than capability, that a weapon that works 70% of the time but costs almost nothing beats a weapon that works 95% of the time but requires industrial infrastructure you don't have. This is a hard lesson for militaries to learn because militaries are built on the assumption that professionalism means sophistication. The best soldiers use the best equipment. The best equipment is the most advanced equipment. The most advanced equipment requires the most resources to produce. Therefore, military power is proportional to industrial capacity. The Panzersack violated that equation. It was primitive, it was crude, it was made by people who had no business making weapons, and it killed some of the most advanced tanks in the world. That's not supposed to happen. The fact that it happened anyway suggests that the assumptions underlying military doctrine might be more fragile than anyone wants to admit. There's a philosophical question at the heart of the Panzersack story. What does it mean to fight a war you know you can't win? Finland knew by 1943 that it wasn't going to defeat the Soviet Union. The population disparity was too extreme. The resource disparity was insurmountable. The best possible outcome was survival, and survival meant making continued aggression too expensive to justify. The Panzersack wasn't a winning weapon. It was a surviving weapon. It was designed not to achieve victory, but to impose costs. That's a different kind of warfare, psychologically. It requires accepting that your best efforts won't change the strategic outcome. They'll just change the price. And then doing those efforts anyway, because changing the price is the only agency you have. The men who used the Panzersack understood this. You can read it in their letters, in their diaries, in the interviews conducted decades later. They didn't think they were heroes. They didn't think they were winning. They thought they were buying time for negotiations, time for Soviet leadership to decide Finland wasn't worth the cost. Time measured in destroyed tanks and dead tankers and burned-out crew members. It's a bleak calculus. It's also the only calculus available to small nations fighting superpowers. You can't win. You can make winning Pyrrhic. The post-war fate of the Panzersack is instructive. Once the war ended, production stopped immediately. There was no peacetime application. There was no export market. The design was too simple to patent, too obvious to claim ownership of. Some of the remaining stockpiles were destroyed. Some were kept in storage in case future conflicts required them. Most just disappeared, distributed, or discarded, or lost in the chaos of post-war reorganization. The weapon had been exactly what it needed to be, a temporary solution to an immediate problem, and once the problem ended, the solution became obsolete. But the concept didn't die. Military forces around the world took note. The idea of infantry portable shaped charges on poles evolved into more sophisticated systems, the Panzerfaust, the RPG series, the AT-4. Modern anti-tank weapons are unrecognizable compared to the crude Finnish poles, but they trace their conceptual lineage back to the same insight. Shaped charges work. Standoff distance matters. Infantry can kill tanks if you give them the right tools. The Panzersack proved those principles in the most brutal possible testing environment, and the lessons learned influenced anti-tank doctrine for the next 80 years. There's a memorial in Finland, not widely known, that commemorates the tank hunter teams. It's a simple stone with names carved into it. Most of the names have dates of death in 1943 and 1944. Most of the dates are separated by days or weeks, not years. These were men who used the Panzersack once, maybe twice, before the odds caught up with them. The memorial doesn't glorify them, it just remembers them. That feels appropriate. Glory is for victories. This is a monument to survival purchased at a price that no one should have had to pay. When you think about the Panzersack now, decades removed from the context that created it, it's easy to focus on the technical aspects, the shaped charge physics, the standoff distance, the tactical applications, but the technical aspects are the least interesting part of the story. What's interesting is what the weapon reveals about humans under pressure, about what people can create when they have to, about what they're willing to do when the alternative is worse, about how desperation strips away sophistication and leaves only what works. The Panzersack worked. It worked because it had to. That's not engineering. That's necessity. And necessity is a more powerful force than any technical specification. The lumberjack who supposedly inspired the weapon, if he existed, if the story is true, probably didn't think of himself as a military innovator. He was just a man who knew how to attach an axe head to a handle, who heard about a problem, who made a connection. The soldiers who used the weapon didn't think of themselves as revolutionizing anti-tank warfare. They were just men trying not to die, trying to stop tanks, trying to buy one more day for their country. The weapon worked not because anyone involved was brilliant. It worked because everyone involved was practical. Practical in the face of impossible odds. Practical when sophistication would have been suicide. Practical enough to take a piece of wood and some explosives and turn it into something that killed machines. That's the legacy of the Panzersack. Not that it was a great weapon, it wasn't. It was adequate. But adequate, deployed by people who had no choice except to make it work, turned out to be enough. Enough to change Soviet tactics. Enough to make advances slower and bloodier, enough to buy time for Finland to survive, enough to prove that sometimes the simplest answer to an impossible problem is just simple enough to work. And in warfare, in history, in life, working is the only thing that matters. Everything else is just decoration on survival.